Great. Hi, everyone. We're so sorry to be late. Unfortunately, we were facing some technical difficulties, but we have made sure that we do this one better for you. And not even one better, I would say we do this two better for you. We now have three guests for this interview. We have Hitishaa, Hans, and we have Avni that has been patiently waiting for this interview to get started. I'll just quickly introduce these people to you. First up, Avni. Avni is one of the top 10 speakers at the Worlds this year. She has been in the squad this year, has been on Team India. Hitishaa is also one of the top 10 speakers in the world this year. And thirdly, we have Hans. Hans has been in the squad for the last 3 years, has broken at AWSTC, and has broken at Talks last year. Thanks a lot, all of you, for joining us. What we are going to do today is we are going to spend around an hour, picking their brain on how they prepared for national selections. And we hope it's useful and helpful thinking about where to start from. Thank you so much for joining us today. Congratulations, Avni and Hitishaa, for being the top 10 speakers in the world. How does that feel? Avni, do you want to take that?
Yeah, it feels absolutely surreal. Like, I cannot believe it to this day. But of course, all of that started from 2 years ago and this elections process. So really excited to be here today to be able to talk about how one goes about approaching that.
Great. Hitishaa, your thoughts?
Yep, I think there's still times where I quite honestly cannot believe it, but it feels really good. Like, I don't know what else to say. It feels really good and it feels very happy. So, yeah.
Okay, that obviously makes a lot of sense. Being top 10 in the world has to feel good, I believe. Okay, Hans, throwing the first question directly at you. To get started, when was the first time you were on the squad? And how much experience in debate did you have when you got on the squad? And like, did you have a lot of WSTC experience back then? Were you able to attend a lot of WSTC competitions before you went to the trials?
Yeah, so the first time I got into squad was in December of 2019. And at that point, I basically, quite frankly, had absolutely no idea what I was doing when it came to WSTC format debating. I hadn't attended a single WSTC format debate competition. I didn't know the format until the week, like until literally the day when Delhi regionals happened. And we were told the format by the selectors. I had done a few debate competitions, but I guess you could call them debate competitions, but they were like, the sorts of like school debate competitions where it's like write a speech and deliver it 2 weeks in advance. So basically, to all intents and purposes, I had zero practical debate experience doing selections for the first time in 2019.
Wow, that's incredible. It's just so heartening to hear that, because a lot of people or a lot of kids that want to turn up to selections are so scared, and I would say are always thinking about the fact that they need to be very prepared and have done multiple WSTC debating competitions before they turn up for selections. So, case in point, Hans has been on squad for 3 years, hasn't done WSTC debating before he got on the squad. Okay, Hitishaa, it's amazing that we get to know about these things, about how you don't need to be doing a lot of WSTC debating. But because a lot of students watching right now are probably very worried themselves that they don't know how to start. So would you tell us how you decided to trial? What were the steps involved in selections? And what was your motivation to get into?
Before I do start with that, I just want to say that, I just want to express that when I was going through the selections process, I was also kind of terrified. So you're not the only one feeling that way if you are feeling that way, because I had massive public speaking fear. So just generally that, but also the idea of speaking for 5 minutes or 6 minutes on straight, it seems really scary, and it's all fine because I think a lot of people are feeling that same way. So with regards to how I entered into selections, I generally had some interest in debating and argumentation, not formal debating because I didn't have particular experience with that earlier as well, but just generally, the class-based discussions we generally have in school and things like that. I like being able to express my opinions and my stances on a couple of things and think of like whether they had advantages or whether they had disadvantages. So I think because of that, I was kind of seeking a place where I could do that. And the idea of doing that on a level that was regional or zonal instead of just a class-based level and meeting other people from my city, meeting other people from my state through that way was really, really exciting to me, which is why when like our school told us that they were trying out for like zonals that year, I got really, really excited and I wanted to try out for my school team. So the way the school like selections process worked for me was that the first thing I did was the zonals round. So I tried out in the 2020 cycle. And so to zonals, I was a part of the West Zone selections. And so I had a team with my school, 2 people I was close friends with. And what we were doing was that in the week coming up, we were trying to get on call as much as we could and doing a bunch of preps together, writing the prepared cases and just making sure we were talking to each other about how we were feeling and just like trying to prepare for debates as much as we could at that point in time. And so zonals happened. After zonals, we had the quiz round or the intermediary stage. I don't know what the official word for it is. It's just basically the second round of selections. And at that point in time, I think like what helped me was that the same teammates I had also made it to the second round of selections, and we still kept doing things together. Like I remember there were multiple times where we were on call and we were just quizzing each other on the GK each of us separately knew, because obviously like all of us individually didn't know everything, but doing it as a team really, really helped us out. But just generally also like learning about the debate format. There were a bunch of videos that ISDS itself has uploaded on its YouTube account. So watching all of those things as a couple of friends together was really, really helpful. And then after the second round, we had national camp. Obviously in the lead up to it, it was also just like trying to do some speeches or trying to prepare for it. But national camp for me was online because it was COVID that year. But during national camp, like basically you just kind of go along with what ISDS is doing because it just makes you do everything. And so you just like, try to make friends, incorporate all the feedback they're doing and just go along with the process and it'll take you to the right place.
That's great to hear. I hope people are noting these bits down and at least making sure that it's very clear that at all points in time, ISDS is going to make sure that you're being provided with what is important in terms of your selections process. And in most cases, what you need to do is just follow the instructions that you have. With that, coming back to Avni, given, and this is something that we know of, so given you hadn't done a lot of WSTC debating before selections and had a very little debate experience, as much as I know, what were your steps in preparation for the selections? Can you share your top 3 bits of advice for what beginners without a lot of experience should do if they are just starting out?
Yeah, so before trialing, I obviously had no experience with WSDC. My zonals were the first time I had ever done a debate in the WSDC format. So I was trying to consume as much knowledge about the format as possible and about the style of debating. So I think the top 3 things that really helped me with this was firstly, watching debate videos. So anyone who's been in team with me or knows me in ISDS knows me as the person who watches an insane amount of debate videos because I really like doing that. So I just used to find WSDC out rounds or deep in rounds around 8 or round 7 with really good teams to be able to watch. And I think that really helped me because I could, one, I think, emulate the style and structure with which various WSDC speeches was happening. I remember like watching, every single WSDC finals from 2019 to 2015. And also it helped me in content generation because after a point when you watch enough debate videos, you start noticing trends in terms of strands of analysis or arguments or clashes that everyone's using. So common analysis on, this is the incentives of corporations or this is the incentives of that particular actor. So watching those debate videos also helped me cross-apply analysis to other debates. So I think that's the one thing that really helped me. They're also really accessible because I think for the online WSDC ones, at least all of them will have their own YouTube channel with most rounds streamed. I think the second thing then was trying to practice speeches on my own. So my school's debate circuit in terms of WSDC wasn't as developed. So I couldn't obviously do spars with other teams. So it was often hard to do speeches. But the way I did that was I just used to go on Hello Motions or sometimes just sift through debate videos as well and pick up a particular motion in a day and give myself around 20 to 30 minutes of prep. I started out with longer prep times and in the lead up to selections tried to reduce the time I was giving myself. And in that prep time, I would just try to generate arguments and then deliver a fair speech and record myself. If I had a senior who was free during that time, I would maybe send them that speech for feedback because they'd been debating for a while. But usually it was also just watch the debate video and then compare my arguments to the arguments they ended up running. I think this is more doable for first speeches because it doesn't take as much time if you're doing it for a first drop. But as you progress through the selections, you want to practice other speeches. You could also do it for like seconds and thirds by just placing yourself within that position in a debate. And if you were that speaker, what speech would you give? And just watching the debate up until that point. I think the final thing that really helped me was in content sessions on YouTube. So a lot of the focus when it comes to gaining knowledge for debating is, of course, some general knowledge in current affairs, which I think is really important. But I think another thing is also just figuring out really common motion categories and finding matter sessions possibly on them. So common motion categories, like, for example, the environment, the criminal justice system, or economics, were topics I knew were being settled on. So I just tried to gain more basic knowledge of concepts in those areas because I think, like, for economics or philosophy, for example, I didn't know as much. So I just used to watch YouTube videos for maybe channels like Crash Course Philosophy, Crash Course Economics, or even the Harvard Justice series. Like these three I've watched in the run up to the intermediary selections to be able to gain knowledge. I also think there are a lot of debate platforms that will have videos like a lot of EUDC prep comps release videos by uni debaters talking about certain things. So our Team India coach Lucia has a video on principles that I remember watching in the run up to selections that was helpful. So yeah, I think those are the top three things that I did.
Wow, I think YouTube then bridges the gap between university debaters and school debaters that way, because if I would be talking to a university debater prepping before a WUDC competition as well, they would also definitely at some point in time talk about Lucia's video on principle. So yeah, just one question on that. Do you have a favorite debate video, Avni?
I actually don't, because this is a question that is too hard to answer. My all-time favorite will always be the 2019 finals between India and Canada, of course.
Yes.
I think that's the only right answer.
Yes, that is always the right answer, everyone, because we won that round. Coming back to Hitishaa, how about if I already have debate experience? You, for instance, this year, Hitishaa, trialed, which was your second year, and you had some experience entering the selection. What was your focus then?
Yeah, I think a bunch of the tips, like Avni said, still apply. And I think it's just kind of important to remember at that stage that, like, it's still just a learning experience and you can never be at a point where you cannot improve anymore. So just constantly trying to do those things and setting a habit and pattern usually helps. But I think if you have some level of debate experience, what worked for me was that, like, I tried to work in ways that were more personalized to me now. So I think one was just that I was identifying things that were knowledge gaps. Like I was really bad at sports and finance motions, I'm not kidding. And so, like, probably figuring out the topics that you know you struggle with a bit and reading up on them. And you have the time to read up on them now because it's not as if, like, you're doing selections tomorrow. You have a couple of times, so you can do those kinds of things now and probably work on that. But also, just like, the second thing is, like, you've probably gotten feedback from the experience you have. So from debate tournaments, if you've done them, or just if you have prior experience with ISDS, maybe that feedback. So just generally making sure you're figuring out what are the recurring trends in feedback. Because for me, it was almost always certain things that I just kept on doing and repeating again and again. So figuring that out and trying to work on them, and trying to work on them specifically in ways that, like, you can now do. So, like, trying to like for me, timing was a big issue. So just like having a bunch of speeches where the focus was just like figuring out timing was an example of what I did, for instance. So just all of those things. I think the third thing is also just like, if you feel comfortable enough in a speaker position, I think it might be good to be at a stage where you can maybe experiment with what's working best for you and just like also try out different speaker positions, because I was someone who only did first speeches in the beginning, and once I felt more comfortable in first speeches, I wanted to learn rebuttal more, and then that's how I transitioned to third speeches. And I do think that helped me a lot more in the long term, because it turns out I did like rebuttal a lot more. So maybe just experimenting around a bit is also good. Yeah.
So I think the biggest takeaway from that is we, in our debating careers, we don't need to get married to speaker roles so soon, because at all points in time, and this is applicable to any speaker role, if somebody wants to do a first speaker always, it will be really useful for them, as Hitishaa just said, to try out a third speech, because that's where the bulk of rebuttal happens, and you get to put yourself into a position where you're forcing yourself to think about the rebuttals. Coming back to Hans. Hans, what is the importance of general knowledge in the selection process? And just tell me, where is a good place to start, and what are your top 3 sources to know more about the world?
Okay, so in terms of the importance of general knowledge, I guess the answer is just knowing about the world is really, really important. I think it's both like Avni and Hitishaa will be spoken about. A big part of getting better or preparing is to just fill out gaps that you have in your knowledge of how the world works, right? And that's important for 2 reasons. The first is like, in a general debate sense, it makes it all the more easier for you to come up and generate new matter if you're aware of like real world context or examples where motions or motions similar to this motion have already played out. But second is just that like you actually know what you're talking about, and so you're not saying nonsense or straight up lying, which unfortunately happens sometimes as well. So yeah, so in order to avoid that from happening, or just like ground your debate in reality, examples are really, really useful. And like on a personal level, I like on a personal emotional level, I value GK quite highly, because I remember that like the moment where debating sort of clicked with me was at North India Zonals in 2019, which was in person at the time. And I just started talking about the Saudi-Iran proxy war and drone strikes in the context of like a video we've been told to watch with one of the selectors. And that was the moment where I was like, oh, I get to talk about things that I'm already interested in. This is really, really fun. And in terms of sources, the complicated thing is like it's impossible for anyone to gain like a comprehensive understanding of everything that they'll ever need to run examples in debates. But just generally, I think first, to get to know basic terminology on topics that are applicable in debates, I think Avni's already mentioned YouTube channels like Crash Course Philosophy and Economics. So ISDS actually like just dumped both playlists on one of their preparatory emails to us during selections in 2019, and we're like, watch all of them, go. And yeah, so that was really useful. Second, this might sound really, really basic, but just if you subscribe to a good daily newspaper, read the newspaper. In particular, read the internationals page, because I think international relations motions a lot of people struggle with. I mean, like generally read pages, read the politics page, read the finance page. But yes, the newspaper, if you have a good one. And third, specifically during the run up to my first selection round, I found long form article content explaining issues to be really, really helpful. So remember, I had borrowed several copies of The Economist from a senior at school. And I remember articles on democratic backsliding in Hungary and the Iran-Saudi proxy war being really, really illuminating to me. And similarly, during the course of that selection itself, ISDS also sent us a really good long-form article by Vox about the war on drugs that I found to be particularly comprehensive. So like, I guess there are some things you can do. So like there's YouTube channels that explain concepts, there's the newspaper, and there's like longer form articles. But like at the end of the day, because the amount of information you need to consume is so vast, at the end of the day, what works best for individual people will differ. So just try to figure out where your knowledge gaps are and look accordingly. So at the moment right now, I am supposed to be reading up about pop culture because I tend to be pretty bad at that because I live under a rock. So Yeah, it differs.
Yep. So what is the last thing that you read about pop culture, Hans?
Actually, today I was watching a YouTube video about a really bad Chinese blockbuster movie that came out in 2013. Not particularly relevant to debates, but like the movie in particular was quite misogynistic and pointed to like a broader problem and like a broader problematic cultural trend in East Asian cinema. So that, yes.
Okay, and my final follow-up, which I thought of asking as in when you started the answer, was how irritating is it if somebody lies in a debate round on general knowledge?
Incredibly. Like incredibly. And here's the thing, right? Like, to be perfectly honest, chances are if someone makes something up and if you're doing it at the school's level, it usually won't get called out, which is especially sad. But if it's on a topic that someone in the room knows about, that you can trust that person to get really, really annoyed. And if that person happens to be an adjudicator or a judge, you should be really, really worried. Like the standout for me this year was one round on Wagner Private Military Corporation's insurrection in Ukraine, Russia, in the context of the conflict. And the team we were debating against said something like, oh, Wagner Group hasn't been able to take the town of Bakhmut, except Wagner had occupied the town of Bakhmut. And that was sort of important in terms of illustrating Wagner's military capabilities. And that was important in the context of the round. And I got really, really ticked off. So yes.
Okay. So yeah, don't lie in debate rounds is the takeaway, because honestly speaking, from a adjudicator perspective, in most cases when you lie, we know, even if we don't say that out, because we don't want to point that out in a feedback, just because it's just demotivating for speakers, it has been taken into consideration because we are supposed to be an average reasonable voter. Yeah, coming back to Hitishaa, Hitishaa, the first stage of selection for most students is the team-based selection. What are some exercises that you would recommend to students to do alongside their teammate, and why is this important?
Yep. I think regarding the why is this important thing first, like I think I touched upon it a bit earlier, but I think just generally like both in the sense that your team needs to work together if you want to do well in the first round of selections, because if all three of you think you're just out for yourself, it's really not going to work, because debate at the end of the day will be won as a team. Like you need to be cooperating, you need to be moving things up, moving things down, working well in tough times. And I know sometimes it can be really, really tense, but I think as a team, you need to figure out how to work through all of those kinds of things. But also just generally like your team is a bunch of people from your school who are also really, really excited and passionate about debate, and just talking about things that you all really like and are working really hard in. It just feels really good, and having a community around you, which is I think what really importantly debate brings. So I think a couple of exercises that like my team did in terms of like approaching selections was, first we tried to do a lot of preps together. So depending on like how much time we had, so we could maybe do 30-minute preps or 1 hour preps, depending on like also the specific selections and like the kinds of format the selections have this year. I'm unsure about them, but just generally trying to like modulate that. And I think it's important to note that like we wanted to do things as much as realistically would look like before the round. So you can't have access to the internet. Ideally you can't be talking to someone about it. You probably want to have divided responsibilities or have some level of time division the way you would want to in the actual tournament, so that you can get a practice, like you can just get in the flow with it. Because I know if you try it out for the first time during the actual tournament, it's a bit of a struggle and some things might not be working. So just making sure you're all doing that. Maybe after that doing practice debates if you are in contact with other teams, or if not, just like having someone deliver the first speech, whoever your first speaker is, that usually works really, really well. the second thing is like doing a bunch of things as a team together. So breaking up tasks. So one of you watches one debate video, the other person watches another debate video. So at the end, it's like you have the information of 3 people when you couldn't have had that. And all 3 of you were just individually doing apparently the same thing. So that's probably not ideal. So you do things like breaking up what kind of topics you're reading up about. So everyone has a different specialization that they can contribute towards in prep, and it just adds on. Or maybe even things like just having each other go through speeches. Like if someone's struggling with rebuttal, going through arguments with them and asking them to rebut them if your strength is rebuttal. So just making sure you're contributing to each other's strengths and weaknesses is really, really important as a team, because all of you will have like different things. And I think the last thing is like, sometimes I know it's just like, sometimes it doesn't have to be that serious. Like sometimes it can just be you're on a call and you're very angrily discussing a speech you just watched in a debate video because you disagree with it for multiple reasons or whatever. Or just like constant calls, just giving each other pep talks, or just like angrily, like kind of annoying the person to do work because you know your teammate has a tendency to procrastinate. So just like making sure you remember that all 3 of you are in it together, and like not letting a quote unquote competitive spirit like drive you apart because you have to go through this round together.
Yep, that's so important. I've seen so many debate teams, irrespective of the age group that they are from, their friendship getting really affected because just people are more or less serious about bits at some point in time. Yep, okay. So before, and this is also a reminder for everyone in the audience to be ready with their questions. And I'm going to ask a question from Avni, after which we'll move on to audience questions. Yep, hi Avni. So do you have any specific tips for students to improve their speaking style, in addition to a lot of tips that we have had talked about for content improvement? And can those things be done at home, and how should they be done at home, etc.?
So I think in terms of style, it's just about practicing it enough times and incorporating it in your speech with active effort enough times that over time it's something that will come naturally to you. So I remember that when I first started debating, one of the things that I was told was my style was relatively good. And the reason for that is because I had started debating with school debates that, as Hans talked about, were elocution speeches in which you just had to write a speech and then deliver it. The thing with those debates is that they prioritize style a lot. So I sort of had a natural tendency to have rhetoric phrases or to have voice modulation within my speeches. But I think if you don't have that, there are particularly 3 things that you should do while, for example, if you're practicing speeches that can actually really help you. So the first thing is marking in your speeches where you want to emphasize or where you want to vary your tone. So if you're giving a practice first proposition, so you can mark your introduction as you want to go really slowly here because you want this to be impactful and you want the judge to be able to take this away even after everyone's speeches. Or if you think this is a phrase that sounds like really smart, like the team lines that we have, sometimes we're really proud of them. So we have them at the end of speeches, at the beginning of speeches, delivered in a different way than the rest of our speech. So that's something that stands out. So doing that and having variation of tone in different places within your speech will really help it stylistically. I think the second thing is having good phrasing. So a lot of style is about how you phrase things as well. So I think sometimes it's just making active efforts to have good phrases. I remember doing style drills as a part of coaching. So within that, what we used to do is we were told to write an introduction and an argument. That's it. You don't have to write an entire speech because the focus there wasn't on content, but rather on style. But the thing you have to do within that one argument is at least have 1 or 2 phrases that rhetorically sound really good. And over time, you just develop a habit of putting those rhetorical phrases, 1 or 2 in every argument, and then emphasizing them, as I said earlier. I think the final thing is just recording your own speeches and recording as in a video recording, ideally, so that you also see what hand gestures you're doing. Because a lot of times, the things that we do that aren't stylistically particularly good are things that we won't realize. So, for instance, I had like this really bad habit in debates of like moving my hands a lot. I still do that. Like if I'm talking, I'll just like move my hands like this. So I was called a windmill for it. And I didn't realize I was doing this because this was just an involuntary thing because I had nothing to do with my hands. But when it was pointed out to me and when I like saw myself doing it because I was recorded doing it, I in the future decided to be more cognizant of it. Like you develop a resting pose for then what you do with your hands because you want to stop moving them. Similarly, if you're like listening to yourself, you can realize if you're going too fast in certain places and probably need to slow down so that judges can catch what you're saying. So I think listening to yourself is also really helpful to be able to realize where you can stylistically improve.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I am going to ask people to send in some questions for us. And also coming back to the answer, Avni, can you give me some examples of specific things that you end up doing in terms of style within a speech, apart from something that you have already told us in terms of an analogy? So I would say, if you remember any speech that you gave for yourself and phrases that you specifically like. So some people just like some bits in introduction that they keep on using, and they just try and fit that in whatever speech they have. And they're also impactful because obviously you can have so many phrases at one point in time. So do you have any favorite phrase? And this is open to Hitishaa and Hans as well if they want to take this up.
I think a lot of my favorite phrases will be in CJS debates because I think, so CJS, the criminal justice system debates, because I think there's a lot of scope for rhetoric there. And I'm also really interested in law. So one of my favorite is whenever you're on a side that is claiming that they're able to reduce the amount that people reoffend after they exit prison, the thing I like to do is their side turns prisons into a revolving door. When 70% of prisoners who exit return within the next 3 months if coming back, that is not a prison. Because prison puts punishment as the focus and rehabilitation as the afterthought. So that's sort of a phrase I really like. Yeah.
Great. Hitishaa, Hans, do you want to share anything on that?
I think there's a decent amount of intersection between. So like there's two components to style, right? Like the first component is just sounding good, and the second component is being able to characterize or paint your world really well. And the second component, I think there's often a useful intersectionality between that and GK. So the bits of style that I've found myself enjoying the most in debates have usually been when we used an example in a really, really impactful way. So there was a debate on like environmental protection that I did last year, where Avni ended up running a really, really good introduction about like shipbreakers in Alang in Gujarat. And that was really, really cool. But like this year, I remember lovingly writing out an outro for another speaker on my team, where the debate was about like religious violence. And I sort of went a little crazy with like within 3 lines, fitting examples of Northern Ireland and Kashmir and whatnot. And so it's really, really fun if you can use examples well.
Yeah.
For me, I think like I kind of suck at coming up with good words myself. So I think the thing I resorted to was just like listening out to other speeches and seeing what I really like, because there are like some debate videos where like someone would say something really pretty and I would pause the video just to think about how pretty that sounded. And so just those kinds of phrases, just like probably keeping them in mind. And like a lot of the motions that are similar themes can like have words that can be reused. So a lot of things from social justice debates can be cross-applied. So just like using the same style and just like tweaking it a bit probably worked the most for me.
Great, that makes sense. Thanks a lot. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll pick up some questions from the chat. First one, I think, is a logistical question that I can answer, which is, what should I do if I don't have a teammate to attend a tournament? Okay, so for selections, we also have individual tracks. So for example, for juniors this year, we had the triathlon and we selected kids from the triathlon who topped the triathlon as well. Coming up, we have a tournament with one of our partners, which is the Champions League, and that's happening in October. I would suggest go on our website, check that tournament you can register individually at that tournament. And I think that solves your problem of, if I don't have a teammate, what should I do? Okay, so this question that I think is really important here is, it would be great if we can have some direct tips about rebuttal, because I also think a lot of individual speaking practice is happening in, let's say, first speaker roles, because that's what you can prepare and deliver. Do you, right off the top of your head, does anyone of you have any specific drill that you use in general for getting better at rebuttals?
I think what I usually do is it's again watching debate videos and looking at what the other side responded with. And like, so basically it's like you listen to a speech, think of responses to the speech, and then compare with the actual responses that were given in the debate. But try not to end it there, but just like think of like what lines the person must have been thinking along to come up with that rebuttal, like what were the kinds of things they were questioning according to the arguments that were made, and trying to replicate that along the other speeches and other debates you do.
Makes sense. So Hans, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So like two things. The first is that I think in many cases, rebuttal isn't that different from argumentation. So I think like, even if you're a rebuttal speaker, doing first speaker drills is still helpful, or like prepping the other side is helpful. But second, I'm not sure how broadly useful this would be. But like one thing that I did was to watch a debate until like about halfway through. So like once 3 or 4 speeches were done, and then to deliver a third speech. So like if you want to do direct drills, then you can do that and then compare notes with the third speaker in the video. The other thing is just that like, I feel like, so again, I don't know how representative this is, but at least for me, when I started out debating in the format, I was terrified of rebuttal or doing rebuttal heavy speeches. So I think the best way to overcome that is just to do practice. And like, regardless of what kind of practice you do, whether it's familiarizing yourselves with cases, because that also familiarizes you with how to attack them and take them down, or doing rebuttal practice, just, do practice.
Yep, great. So there's this question that is about, should someone think about alternating between speaker roles during regional selections? Any thoughts on this?
I think it depends, obviously, but I think if you are very, very comfortable in a specific speaker role and like you think that you are much better at it and you think your teammates, for instance, excel at other speaker roles, maybe not, because you already have set things that are working for each other and you already know what the dynamic is with each other in those kinds of things, and you can work to your strengths. But if you don't know it, for instance, or you and your teammates have disagreements on what kind of position you want to go, because maybe both you and your teammates want to go first speakers, maybe alternating, coming to some level of a compromise might be good. It can also look like, I know a couple of people who did this, but just like deciding speaker roles according to the motion. So if you are very comfortable with the motion, you might be feeling more comfortable going a rebuttal position because you feel like you can come up with ideas on the spot. But if you feel like you don't know anything about the topic, it's fine. You can go in as a first speaker and your teammates can help you out in preparation time for that specific debate. So I think just like seeing whatever feels most comfortable at that moment probably works best.
Yep. So I think one thing to note there is, because I've seen kids and senior people also having this misconception that if they know a lot about the motion, they should do the first speech. However, if they know a lot about the motion, it will be really beneficial if they can put out that information in prep and put themselves under pressure to do the rebuttal bit, because they're most suited to do so. And that's a very good advice that Hitishaa just talked about. Avni, Hans, I saw both of you unmuted. So yeah, please go ahead.
during my selections, I alternated as well. So I was alternating between second and third. And I agree with Hitishaa in terms of it depends on the motions. The way at least we did it was motion, but also we had a default that we could do. So a lot of the time, sometimes it's confusing based on motion who should go first or who should go second, because it's not really anyone's niche or it's multiple people's niche. So I would still recommend having a default. And our default was usually based on prop and op. So I would go 3O and 2P, and the other person would go second and third based on this side. So I think it's just generally useful to have an idea based on sides as well, because I think second speeches on either side and third speeches on either side are kind of different depending on the side as well.
Yep. I just one little thing to add. This really only matters for the first round of selections, because after that ISDS will make you do everything anyways. So you may as well just prepare for it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Hats. I was going to, I planned that was my closing to this answer, being like, oh, but we are going to make you do everything. So whatever you feel comfortable at, or even if you do change speaker roles, your future in terms of what you're doing in speeches, in most cases, not going to be decided by you. Because we want to check you how you perform in all roles, because those all roles, as we talked about this in this interview as well, they just have specific bits that makes you complete as a speaker or as a debater. And they prioritize some bits differently. Okay, I think this is a very interesting question, because at some point in time, I also felt this to be an issue in general. It might have been because I was less interested in the bit I was studying for, but specifically, this becomes an issue when someone is trying to consume a lot of information, but what is happening with them is the information is not sticking with them. So I've seen variations of this, okay? So I've seen people that know a lot aren't able to employ that information within a debate round, and also people that read a lot but are not able to recall that information as and when it is required. So any thoughts on that?
I think the thing I do there is whenever you're reading or consuming content, so the first thing is if you're reading the news, actively also trying to think of 2 or 3 motions you can cross apply this to. So whenever we do current affairs drills, it's usually followed by, and what motion would you use that in? So if we're reading about US banning affirmative action, we'll probably generate a couple of motions we could use that in, and how we would use that in if you were to flip it on both sides. So you're actively connecting what you're reading to a debate motion as well, so that it then just happens significantly more naturally. I think the second thing would also just be whenever, if, for example, you're consuming content related to a particular motion type, and this is in terms of if you can't remember it later, specifically practicing a few motions, because I think at one point it's not about actively recalling arguments which have, for example, become stock over the years. It's also just about you've done them enough times so you already know them. So if you're watching a animal welfare session on YouTube, then pulling up a couple of animal welfare debates on hello motions or other motion generators, and then actively trying to cross apply the knowledge that you've just gained into those motions.
I think a thing to add here, because like I was this person for a very long period of time. And it was embarrassing because like after the debate, you realize, oh, I actually knew all of this stuff. Why didn't I run any of it? One thing that is like a good piece of practice is, I think the reason why this often ends up happening is because when you read a lot about a topic and you become like acquainted with the nuances or like little details of the topic, you often tend to lose sight of like the bigger picture, or like the way in which you can utilize the topic in debates. And so I think a useful exercise is just compressing, or like is practicing explaining the topic in a really brief and easy to understand way. So if you have like a certain example of a foreign intervention, or if you have an example of a certain type of social policy, just think of like a 30-second way of explaining the whole thing to make clear both a bit of like its logical mechanization and its impacts in a manner that would be easy for the average person to understand. And so once you're able to do that, I think it becomes a lot easier for you to just like reach into your repository of knowledge in a way that is like useful and you can immediately apply in debates.
So for me, the struggle was slightly different. It was less like translating what I read into arguments. It was more just, I would literally not remember it in a debate. Like I would just forget that I read it. And like, it was funny because I would do a lot of reading specifically for debate purposes. And just when the debate actually started, I had no clue what I'd read. So I think what worked for me was just like one, notes. So like it depends on like whatever style works for you. It doesn't have to be like very, very serious, like stacks of registers. Like what worked for me was like I really, really prefer it if I explain it to someone else, because that makes me like kind of go through it. And so I just sent a bunch of voice recordings to a lot of my friends, which was just going through that topic. And then when that debate tournament was approaching, I would just on 2 times speed just listen to all of those voice notes again, or maybe go over those notes again if that's like something I struggle with. The second thing is also just like I think I have this tendency where if I'm doing it for like entirely quote unquote academic purposes, or just for like, oh, I need to apply it in a XYZ theoretical round, it's really hard for me to remember anything. So I had to add an element of relatability or kind of like fun to it. So maybe just like relating it to things you have seen around you, experiences you have seen around you, just generally that kind of thing, but also just like trying to make it fun basically is just like what worked. I really spent too many hours formatting my notes.
That's very useful, especially because I, this was the inhibition that I had with the question as well, which is we are either going to answer the first bit, which is how to employ that knowledge, or the fact as to how to remember the knowledge that we have. But we were able to do both of that, which is incredible. So there's this question about how to get better at animal welfare motions. So they have been around for a long time, and I think they have been getting more specific, and also the amount of motions that we, or the percentage of animal welfare motions that we see nowadays is also on the increase to an extent. So what do you guys have any specific tips on how to get better, I think, at content generation in animal welfare motion?
I think in terms, so the first thing is, I think Tejas actually has a session in animal welfare. It's uploaded on, I think, Team Mexico's debate channel. So I think the first thing is it's very, very useful watching that, because I think he runs through different types of animal welfare debates that exist and common arguments on either side you can make with those. But I think the second thing is, if you don't know much about animal welfare, and I think this applies for a lot of motions, that if you don't have knowledge about them, what you need to do is strip them back to the basics. It doesn't matter if you don't know a lot about it. Think about it in terms of any other social movement debate. Like the aim of the animal welfare movement at the end of the day is to be able to improve the rights of animals, get more attention, get more support, and in general, get buy-in for the sorts of change that they want. So just thinking about the end goals of the movement, which will be common with other movements, and then thinking backwards from there. So if you want to prove that you're more likely to get change for the animal welfare movement in this side, how might this motion be able to do that? So I think it's just not thinking about it in terms of an animal welfare debate, but just like any other debate you would do. So just like, for example, like remove that word from the in motion and think about it.
Great. Yeah, Hitishaa, please go.
Yeah, so just one last thing. Like, I think it's also useful to remember that, like, in debates about animal welfare, it's not just enough to, like, if you are, I don't know, in opposition to that motion, just come up and run an argument about, oh no, you hurt humans, and it just ends there. Like, I think you just need to make sure to realize that you are talking about animals in this debate, and that's someone you need to care about as a stakeholder, and you can't just say the word humans and think you already won the debate.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so there's some bits of logistical questions that I quickly finish, and then we'll move on to the debate questions. Okay, so we cannot share any groups that we have because we don't moderate, as ISDS, we don't moderate any such group. But also, if we don't moderate a group, I don't know how we can suggest you to that, because we don't have any control over the conversations there. So I think a better place for that would be to discuss this among your peers and get something out from there. But also, if the group is meant for practice or just drills, I think there are enough individual drills that can also happen. And you can always find people within your institution who are interested. I just think you will have to take a bit more responsibility if there are not a lot of people around you who are constantly interested in debating. But it's such a sport that if you literally show someone a WSTC finals video or a WDC finals video on YouTube, 9 out of 10 people are going to get interested into the activity by themselves. Second, this question about reading current affairs and applying, I think, has been answered already. Yep, the selections are segregated between seniors and juniors. So we do zonal selections and we also do a senior selection. All the details are up there on the website for ISDS. Please take a look there. For TCL as well, once registrations are over or once you register yourself, there will be an orientation where we'll explain the format and we will explain what rounds there will be, how you will go towards the final rounds, what will be the process, everything. Great. So some general tips for second speech.
I think I'm going to start this off as I do seconds. So in terms of second speech, I think the first thing is trying to figure out what structure works for you, because I think there are different approaches to second speeches. So some people prefer doing clashes and organizing it in terms of questions that would ultimately decide the debate. Some people prefer doing it as rebuttal section and then a rebuilding section and then their own argument. So I think the first thing is figuring out which structure works for you. Personally, the clash structure works better for me because I think that helps me organize content more efficiently. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, in a second speech, it is really important to have prioritization, because I think over time, second speeches have also started to become really strategic speeches. So you need to figure out what your path to victory is in a debate and try to, from the second speech, sort of build that narrative around which clash you think you're winning on. And also prioritization in terms of, obviously, you can't respond to everything from the other side because you have limited time. So what do you think is the most important thing to respond to that will ultimately end up becoming the biggest deal within their case? I think the third thing is, in a lot of debates, I think a lot of WSDC outruns these days, second speaker arguments tend to get deprioritized. I disagree with that trend. I think second speaker arguments are a brilliant way to win a debate, as evidenced by the number of times Hitishaa has made my second speaker arguments at WSDC. So I think trying to, as a team, come up with a good second speaker argument, specifically because the other side will then a lot of times just not respond to it, is really helpful, because then you can blow it up and collapse on it in third. It's my favorite thing when that happens in debates.
Yeah, Hitishaa, yes.
Yes. So I don't have that much experience going directly second, but I'll tell you things that like I have experience with interacting as a third speaker with a second speaker, or just generally interacting as teammates of a second speaker. So I think the first thing is, second proposition is really hard, because it's like first opposition comes up, dumps a bunch of material, and you're supposed to spend a vast majority of your speech rebutting it with like just having heard it like 2 seconds ago. So I think it's just very important as a second speaker to know that, like, quite honestly, it's very okay to ask for help. Like, you should definitely be asking your first speaker to give you some pieces of things that they think are strong responses. You should also be asking your third speaker for help. If you have time during prep, you should try to set out some amount of time where you can think of responses, because it's not just about whether you are a good or a bad debater. Like, genuinely, even the best debaters struggle with responding that quickly. So just like, you need to make sure you're trying to accommodate all of that and just have some experience with it. Yeah.
Yep, I think that's really pretty useful. Yes, please go ahead and I'll talk about this.
One, continuing, I think, with second proposition speakers, I think it's really important that, like, certain parts of the 2P speech. I think most critically, well, now that you've heard what the opposition stance is and what their case line is, particularly like the difference between both sides, it's important to make sure that like second proposition or like second speech in general has an idea of how it fits into like the broader strategic push in the case, because you don't want to be in a situation where second speaker says things that may not be relevant or worst case end up harming your case, which unfortunately happens sometimes. The second thing is just that, personally as a third speaker, if a second speaker comes up with a good independent argument that is a potential independent path to victory, I have a really bad day. Because like a third speaker already needs to do a bunch of things, like respond to a bunch of material, defend a bunch of material, weigh a bunch of material, ideally expand their own second speaker's argument. And so when you as a second speaker are able to make a really good argument, which like Avni is great at doing, you aren't just like making things a lot easier for your third speaker, you are significantly messing up the day of the other team's third speaker. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's great. And obviously, this is what I would want to talk about, because I feel in most cases, just because it has been set in stone that the first speech is where the material needs to come through, the third speech is where the responses need to come through, we tend to forget the fact about how much pressure a second speaker is under, especially in situations like second P, because literally all positive material comes through in a first off speech. So I think it's a genuinely great advice to please make sure that you're asking your teammates to also parallelly think for the responses, because it's definitely better to have three people thinking about the same bit, because your chances to get a response which is good increases threefold, I would say, at that point. Yeah, great. Thanks a lot for this. Thank you for taking so many questions. Thank you for turning up after the scheduled time as well, because that just the technical difficulties sometimes end up delaying stuff, and we're really sorry for our audience as well. We'll make sure that this doesn't happen in future, but also these were things that we had no control over, even when we ensured that such stuff doesn't happen. So thanks a lot, everyone. We have recorded this session as well, so we'll be sharing the recordings. You will be able to go over the recording once again, because obviously if you haven't taken notes, because I genuinely think this was note-taking worthy, you can do that as well later. I hope that you keep checking the ISDS website, because that's one of the most important sources of information for us. So if you keep a tab on that, you will know when your selections are. If you keep a tab on that, the issues in logistical issues that you have will not resurface, and you will have a lot of clarity going forward. And I hope I see a lot of you at selections this year as well. Thanks a lot, Hitishaa, Avni, and Hans. Thanks a lot for turning up. Thanks, everyone, for turning up for the session as well.